Hey guys, today I'm going to be reviewing 5 books. And those are going to be The Almond Tree by Michelle Cohen-Corasanti, Longborn by Joe Baker, Codename Chimera by J.K. Percy, Palace of Spies by Sarah Zettel, and Under the Black Ensign by L. Ron Hubbard. Since this is a compilation of 5 reviews, I'm going to try and make this as short as possible. I'm going to try something different for my review layout system. In the comments below, if you guys like this format of group reviews, please let me know. So with that said, I'm going to get going. The Almond Tree by Michelle Cohen-Corasanti tells the story of a Palestinian boy named Iqmad Hamid who is gifted with a mathematical mind. The novel starts in 1955 and follows Iqmad as he develops from a child into a teenager into a young adult, and then ends in 2009 when he is 62 years old. This is not just a story about Iqmad, it's also a story about the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's a story about hatred and prejudice, enemies and friends, love and death, and education and tradition. Iqmad is only one person in this world, but he is one person willing to make a difference. This is actually not a book that I would typically read, but I'm glad that I won it through the Goodreads giveaways section, because had I not won it, I don't think I would have read it otherwise. I guess my concerns about reading it was that it would be have too much politics in it and end up being preachy and annoying, which is what I hate about books like that. But if you cannot already tell from the summary, the book is so much more than that. The characters in this book are simply amazing, and Corasanti's writing is absolutely gorgeous from start to finish, and her writing is very descriptive and very haunting, I think. And you're just left with a lot of very lingering images once you finish the book. And I think this book is also quite an eye-opener. Iqmad was such a wonderful character to experience this ride with. He's very believable. For one thing, you get to follow his life from a child to an elderly man, and you get to witness all of his hardships and the good things in his life, as well as all of his accomplishments in the face of these unbelievable odds. Poor Iqmad is this mathematical genius. He's a child prodigy, and he's living in this world that is not acknowledging his gifted mind. So basically, throughout the entire book, you are rooting for this character to be acknowledged for his genius and rooting for him to receive the education that he deserves. One of the things that I particularly liked about Iqmad was how he progresses over the course of the novel. He starts off very much this child of circumstance, and you get to see his own personal prejudices about the Israelis and his hatred towards the Israelis. So when Iqmad does finally go to university, then he develops a whole different set of prejudices, and he actually becomes friends with Israelis. And then he also starts to see his own people in a different light. But it's also through his education that he starts to become a bit naive, and he begins to think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is something that could be easily resolved. So I really loved how Corasanti presented those two sides to him over the course of the novel. So the book is called The Almond Tree. What's up with the almond tree? It takes until pretty much the end of the book to fully grasp what the almond tree symbolizes. The almond tree basically is the one firm, constant thing in Iqmad's life. And it's this almond tree that is witnessing both the good and the bad in Iqmad's life. I really just found Corasanti's use of the almond tree very beautiful and poetic, and very subtle at the same time. I really suggest that you read The Almond Tree if you get the chance. It is just, like I said, very eye-opening and beautifully written and fantastic set of characters. And there are political elements to it, but don't let that distract you from the book. And I am really glad I won this because it's probably one of my favorites of the year so far. Moving on to Longborn by Joe Baker, which is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, done Downton Abbey style, if you will. The story is told through the eyes of the servants of the Bennet family. Sarah is the maidservant of Elizabeth Bennet and spends her day helping out with the other servants, whether that be in the kitchen or outside. Sarah simply wants more from her life. She wants more than just constantly cleaning Elizabeth Bennet's clothes. So one day, a new footman arrives at Longbourn, and Sarah's orderly world is thrown out of order. There's something mysterious about this new footman, and Sarah is determined to find out what his secrets are. So, do you love Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen? Do you love Downton Abbey? Then this book is probably going to be a must for you. Like I said, Longbourn is basically a Downton Abbey version of Pride and Prejudice, where you're getting to see the events through the eyes of the servants. A very upstairs-downstairs sort of thing. There's this really great paragraph in the first chapter that really sets up the mood of the whole story, and I'm going to read that paragraph to you really quickly. The young ladies, meaning the Bennet girls, might behave like they were smooth and sealed as alabaster statues underneath their clothes. But then they would drop their soiled shifts on the bedchamber floor to be whisked away again and cleansed, and would thus reveal themselves to be the frail, leaking, forked bodily creatures that they really were. Perhaps that was why they spoke instructions at her from behind an embroidery hoop, or over the top of a book. She had scrubbed away their sweat, their stains, their monthly blood. She knew they weren't as rarefied as angels, and so they just couldn't look her in the eye. I thought this was just a fantastic way to open up the novel, because when you think about Pride and Prejudice, you think about this grand romance between Darcy and Elizabeth. You don't think about the behind the scenes of the story. You never think about the household staff who is doing all the cooking and the cleaning. Basically, Longbourn reveals the unpretty side to Pride and Prejudice, which I thought was really cool. When we as modern readers think about Pride and Prejudice, we really glamorize that time. We don't really think about all the inconveniences. As far as the characters go, I did quite enjoy the majority of the characters, I guess more specifically the household staff, since that is where the majority of the novel is. You have Mr. and Mrs. Hill, you have the main character Sarah, you also have a girl named Polly, and then later in the book you also have the footman James. Despite this book having a really great premise and idea and setup, I actually found the characters and the story to be kind of flat. I felt like I never really got to know these people, and out of the entire household staff, I really found Mrs. Hill the most interesting. She was one of the most interesting characters. There's some scandal from her past that's brought up in the book, which is very interesting and kind of makes you look at Pride and Prejudice in a different way. Sarah and James have this love-hate relationship throughout the entire book, which in some ways was a bit tedious. Their romance honestly seemed very rushed and just kind of thrown together. Even Sarah's relationship with Mr. Bingley's servant Ptolemy I found really odd and awkward. And Sarah was only attracted to him just because of how exotic he was. One of the things that I went into Longbourn expecting was all these appearances from Pride and Prejudice characters, but really all these characters had cameos. Mr. Darcy is in probably 2 or 3 scenes over the course of the entire novel, and those scenes are very brief. Mr. Wickham is probably in there the most out of all the classic Pride and Prejudice characters. Elizabeth is in there quite a bit too, but nowhere near as much as I was expecting. And some characters seem to have very random subplots. There was this whole thing with Mary Bennet having a crush on Mr. Collins, which I don't think was needed. The big thing that I was disappointed with was the lack of Lydia and Wickham in that developing relationship, because that's a part of Pride and Prejudice that just kind of really happens quickly and suddenly and you're shocked. And so I thought the big part of this book was going to be the thing of how the servants find out about Lydia and Wickham, and they're the first to find out. Because the servants, throughout the entire novel, really witness a lot of stuff between the classic Pride and Prejudice characters. and that's where like all the gossip starts. So I think Joe Baker could have played with the Lydia Wickham thing a lot more and involved the household staff with that a lot more, I think. Overall, I didn't love this book, but nor did I hate it. I was just very between, kind of meh with the whole book. I think there was a lot of great potential for this book, so that's kind of why I'm disappointed. But still, if you're interested in seeing a Downton Abbey style book like this with Pride and Prejudice, then this might be of interest to you, and I recommend it for that alone. Codename Chimera by J.K. Percy is a mystery thriller that starts off with the mysterious death of an antiques dealer. The only item found on this dead man is a book on ancient Greek creatures. Private Detective Kevin Criss is on the case along with his assistant Penny and his wealthy billionaire friend Michael. Together, they have to discover the contents of Codename Chimera. I'm going to start off by saying that the authors of this book contacted me to read this, and they sent me a PDF file since I don't have an e-reader. And the book is very short. It's just a little over 100 pages. So basically just a little novella of sorts. But overall, I did find the premise of the story intriguing and fascinating. But even though this had some great potential and promise, I found a lot more issues with it than I would have liked. First off, this did not seem like a completed story. Honestly, it felt like a second or third draft of a book. There were massive tons of editing and grammar errors, and I just didn't understand half the time how characters were connecting things. Characters were making big leaps in regards to clues. The narrative did not feel very smooth. It often felt very jumpy. And what I hated the most about this story was the dialogue. I have never seen such horrendous dialogue. I hated it. These people did not seem like real people, like how real people would speak. The characters seriously had a lot of promise, but like I said, they felt very much like second or third draft characters who weren't fleshed out enough, and I just didn't know anything about them. And I'm not going to lie, the detective of the story, Kevin Criss, felt an awful lot like a Sherlock Holmes ripoff. There were certain things about Kevin Criss's hobbies and his personality, his mannerisms, his speech patterns that felt a lot like Sherlock Holmes. Either he really did read like that, or because I'm in the middle of reading the complete Sherlock Holmes, so I've had a lot of Sherlock in my head. Maybe that was some sort of influence while I was reading this, I don't know. Penny seemed awfully like a Mary Sue, and I hate Mary Sue-ish characters. I think Michael, the billionaire friend, was probably the one character that I really latched onto the most, and I loved his personality. And then as far as the murderer, I'm not going to spoil who the murderer was, but I pretty much guessed who the murderer was maybe good 20 pages into the story. I feel incredibly bad for giving this negative review since the authors so kindly offered to send me this book. But I'm not going to sit here and give a phony review because that would just be dishonest to fellow readers. It wouldn't be very honest to the writers themselves either. This story basically needs some major revisions. Characters need to be fleshed out more. The editing and grammar need to be fixed. The overall structure needs to be a bit more cohesive. And I hate to say it, this may sound very snobby or arrogant. I hope it doesn't come across that way, but this story felt like something I would have read back in a creative writing class. So, moving on to Palace of Spies by Sarah Zettel, which is the first book in the Palace of Spies series. The book starts off in the early 1700s under the reign of George I of England. After refusing to marry her uncle's chosen suitor, Peggy Fitzroy is thrown out onto the streets to fend for herself. It's here where Peggy runs into some men who want her to disguise herself as a lady-in-waiting to Princess Caroline after this former lady-in-waiting died under mysterious circumstances. Peggy's mission? Believably disguise herself as this former lady-in-waiting and become a spy. Palace of Spies is a book full of wit and comedy and murder and deception. I really enjoyed this book. It's actually a young adult book, I believe. It didn't take itself too seriously at all. It was basically just wildly fun and amusing. And to be honest, I'm not too familiar with this time in history. If you've been watching my channel, you guys know that I'm more familiar with like the Tudor era. And this is about the Hanovers, and the Hanovers are a very vague subject to me, and a lot of the stuff in the book was kind of flying over my head, and I didn't quite understand some of the historical references or significances. And more specifically, what I was a little bit confused about was the whole conflict between the Hanovers and the Stuarts and the whole right to succession. So basically, I need to do some further research into this era. Peggy was such a fantastic heroine. Her mother's dead. Her father's mysteriously vanished. Her uncle just hates her and she hates him. I do think events happened too easily for Peggy or too coincidental. The night before Peggy is kicked out of the house, that's when she runs into this man named Tenderflint, who proposes that Peggy become a spy. So when Peggy does get kicked out of her house, she immediately goes to Mr. Tenderflint. I was expecting a couple chapters dealing with Peggy out on the streets and dealing with this hardship of living out on the streets. And instead, she sits outside for a couple hours, okay, and then she's like, oh, I'll go to that Tenderflint guy. I did appreciate that the novel did move rapidly, but I thought it moved a bit too rapidly right there with Peggy getting kicked out of the house, up to her meeting with Tenderflint. I do think Peggy was just a really terrific character and someone that I think teenagers can relate to. She's very smart and clever, and she really knows how to handle herself and handle other people who are bullying her. Of course, this is a YA novel. Where's the inevitable romance? And actually, the romance is not really a big part of this book. Peggy's biggest crush is this apprentice painter named Matthew, and he doesn't even really pop up into the story maybe halfway through. The most they ever do is just make eyes at each other and flirt, though they do team up together for the big climax of the novel, where the whole plot finally comes together and you discover who murdered the former lady-in-waiting to Princess Caroline. I really enjoyed that the romance was not a big part of this novel. I found it very refreshing for once. It was nice to see Peggy make her own decisions and be a part of this spy team and really develop as her own character rather than a male character coming in and defining her that way. The romance elements of this book are very much more of a subplot, but I have a feeling books 2 and 3 and so on in the series will develop the romance even more, and that will develop into something more than just a subplot. And like I keep saying, this book is a YA novel, but that was kind of part of the reason there were a few things that were annoying me about this book in general. I found it much too modern. Practically every single chapter, Peggy had to remind the reader that she was a poor girl in a world ruled by men and she had no opinions. Seriously, she said this every single chapter, and that her thought process like that is too much of a modern thought process. That back in that time, being a woman with men ruling the world, that was the norm. I think that was much too modern for Peggy to sit and say that. And adding to the modern nature of the story, this novel reminded me an awful lot about Marie Antoinette, the movie starring Kirsten Dunst. I've never seen the movie, but I've seen the trailers, and from the trailers I always got the impression that this was just too modern and girly. And also, if you've seen the CW show Reign, which is heavily historically inaccurate with the costuming, and it just all looks too modern. Basically take Marie Antoinette and Reign, combine all that, and you get a Palace of Spies in terms of the modern nature of the story. My edition of the book is actually an ARC copy. That's why on the cover it says A Most Dangerous Deception instead of just Palace of Spies. I guess they went through a title change. But since this is an ARC copy, there were a few things in this that I do not know are going to be in the final edit of the story. For instance, whenever Peggy would say words like forehead or behind, or any such letter where there's an H in the middle of the word, the H would be taken out and replaced with an apostrophe. And I didn't get that at all. And there were also these parts in the book that I found really distracting and annoying. I'll show you. I don't know how well you can see this, but whenever words had like double E's or something, this random symbol was used, and I don't even know what that symbol's called. I have no idea what that symbol's called, but it was annoying how this symbol was used constantly. Overall, I still quite enjoyed this book, and I'd really love to continue with the series. Like I said, the only problems I had with it was some of the editing and word structuring, and the fact that the characters in the story were a bit too modern in places. So yeah, if you love historical YA, you'll really love this. But if you're someone who likes Philippa Gregory or Alison Weir, for example, this might not be the thing for you. And the last book I'm going to be reviewing, Under the Black Ensign by L. Ron Hubbard. This is a pirate's adventure story which follows Tom Bristol, who was press-ganged into joining the British Navy. After nearly killing the Lord High Governor, Bristol is sentenced to 100 lashes. But before Bristol receives those lashes, his ship is suddenly boarded by pirates, and Bristol is set free. So Bristol sets out on this great, grand, epic journey. First, he's accused of killing another pirate. He's also accused of harboring a woman on board. And then Bristol is even stranded out on an island to fend for himself. Full of swashbuckling adventure, Under the Ensign is a must for pirate adventure seekers. I also won this book on Goodreads. I think every single book besides Codename Chimera I won through giveaways on Goodreads. It was an okay read. I didn't like it, didn't hate it. I was just meh with it once again. This book seriously only took me about maybe an hour and a half to read from start to finish. It's incredibly short, barely even 100 pages. So because of it being 100 pages, there wasn't much in the way of character development. It's very much a swashbuckling adventure story. And I was quite confused the whole time. Maybe I'm just stupid, I don't know. There's a glossary in the back of the book that has all the pirating terms and the shipping terms, and the glossary still didn't help me out. The majority of the book was spent mostly on these epic ship battles out on the ocean, which that's where I was having the most difficulty following. And because I was having trouble following that, I found all of that very boring. I did like Bristol, though. He was like Robin Hood on water. Jim, aka Lady Jane, was the only female in the book. And of course, she wasn't written very well either. This book was wrote back in the 1930s, so obviously Jim is a damsel in distress. But Jim did help Bristol out on quite a few occasions, so she wasn't entirely useless. Overall, this book simply just wasn't my thing. It was kind of boring. But if you like pirate stories, short pirate stories, then you'll probably really like this. So that's it for my 5 reviews, you guys. Remember in the comments, please let me know if you like this format, and if you've read any of these books, or if you want to read them, let me know. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!